I am Cindy Kelly, and this is Thursday, December 14, 2017, and I'm in Geneva, Switzerland, with Philippe Halban. And my first question is for you to tell us your full name and spell it.
So my name is Philippe Halban. I usually pronounce it the English way. It's spelt the French way with two P's and an E at the end. My mother was French. That explains my first name. And I'm delighted to be able to speak with you today about my father.
Just one thing to interject. Could you spell Halban?
Yeah, Halban is spelled Halban. Yeah, so my father's family on his father's side originally came from Poland and moved from Poland to Austria as part of the empire towards the latter part of the 19th century. And his grandfather was a senior civil servant at the Austrian court and was the equivalent of cabinet secretary to the upper house. And interestingly enough, the name Halban is not actually the original family name. They were called Blumenstock, which means a flower stem. And the emperor and his court at the time felt it, to be polite and non-polemical, a little sensitive and embarrassing to have their senior courtier with such an obviously Jewish name. And they therefore offered him a title in exchange for his agreeing to change his family name. So he was given the equivalent of a knighthood. He was called Ritter von, but not Blumenstock. He changed it to any name of his choosing that was not too obviously Jewish. So he chose the name Halban, which is totally invented and, ironically enough, comes from a romantic 16th century Polish poem, one of these enormous poems that take up a whole book. And Halban was the standard bearer of a minority sect in this story. So it was a little tongue-in-cheek with an allusion to the Jews, but which was not obvious to the court. So since then we've been called Halban, and the title von Halban, Ritter von Halban, my father dropped the Ritter very, very early on, and he dropped the von altogether during the war after the Anschluss, and he was so disgusted by the behavior of the Austrians that he didn't wish to carry any title related to the empire.
That's good. So tell us, when was your father born and where?
He was born in 1908 in Germany, actually, in Leipzig, and spent the first part of his life in Germany following his father's career. His father was a physical chemist and had a chair in physical chemistry, first in Germany, and then when my father was a little older, in Zurich. And when my father moved to Zurich, he also did his PhD thesis at the University of Zurich. And after that, moved as a postdoc to Paris, but also spent during that time, which was 1935, 1936, a year as a postdoc in Niels Bohr's lab in Copenhagen. And that's when he started shifting his interest towards atomic physics.
And his degree was in physical chemistry?
No, his degree was in physics, but in specific aspect of atomic orientation, as I understand it. I'm not a physicist myself, although I am a scientist. And he very quickly became interested in pure atomic physics, I guess, after he moved to Joliot-Curie's lab in Paris and with this postdoctoral year with Niels Bohr. And very quickly assumed, I think, quite a prominent role in Joliot-Curie's group, as from 1936 until he left for England in 1940.
Okay. Well, let's go back for a minute to his work with Niels Bohr. And he was also working there with Otto Frisch, is that right?
That's right. But as I understand it, Niels Bohr's group was highly focused on the nucleus and nuclear elements, and with Frisch in the lab at the same time, there was obviously very active research on the nature of the atom and whether fission could be achieved, and in which case, what would the consequences of such fission be? And that clearly was the main thrust of the work in the Paris group from 1936 through until 1940.
So under Joliot, he was continuing his postdoc, or was that?
Well, this was in essence his first/second postdoc. So he was a junior member of the group, but it's clear from the publications in Nature coming out of that work in the late 30s, as well as the patents that were issued by the French Patent Office, that there were 4 scientists involved in that work as co-authors and cited on the patents, namely Joliot-Curie, Joliot-Curie as he liked to be called, Lew Kowarski, Francis Perrin, and my father Hans Halban. So there were 4 major co-authors of this work. But clearly Joliot-Curie was the head of the group.
So can you tell us a little bit about Joliot-Curie and who he was?
I can't really tell you anything at all other than what I've learnt from the literature, and also from looking at my father's correspondence throughout the war with Joliot, and my father's diaries, which outline very clearly his relationship with Joliot, very close relationship. So throughout the war, they continued to be in contact to the best of their ability, given that Joliot was in occupied Paris and my father was first in Cambridge, UK, and then in Canada. But there is indirect correspondence, and it was clear that my father was doing his best to make sure that Joliot received food packages and every kind of comfort that my father could possibly offer him, and the exchange of letters in this quite lengthy correspondence was entirely cordial. And indeed, my father, in his correspondence with many colleagues after the war, despite the fact that he and Joliot were no longer getting on at all well, and he was not invited back to Joliot's lab at the end of the war, there was a breakdown for reasons that I think we now understand. He always makes it very clear that he regretted this very deeply, because he considered and continued to consider Joliot a very close friend and esteemed colleague. So there was a kind of delicate and sensitive relationship, but which was originally based on total confidence and admiration and friendship.
I guess we can get to this earlier, but would you say the complications in their relationship related to the wartime secrecy and all of that?
Yes, as I understand it, again, I never spoke directly about this with my father. He died when I was too young. I did speak about it at some length with a French colleague of my father's, Bertrand Goldschmidt, who wrote a brilliant book about this period of nuclear research, and specifically the French contribution, and who was recruited to Montreal for the Anglo-French nuclear effort under my father's leadership, initially at any rate. So my father recruited him, and he was also a friend of my mother's. So that there's a kind of family link. And I met with him on several occasions after I moved to Geneva in the 70s. And he explained in some detail what had gone on, and I think in a very objective way. And the main reason for Joliot's hostility towards my father at the end of the war, so this is 1944 to 1946, was because he felt that my father had let down his commitment to Joliot's group and to the French government, and that he had shared too much information with the English, and indeed the Americans, which, as we now know, was absolutely not the case, because there was no communication between the Americans and the Anglo-French effort. Whereas my father had undertaken to always represent the best interests of the French government and to defend the patents throughout his time in exile. So Joliot felt that he'd been let down. He also felt, as I understand it, that whereas the original agreement for these patents with the French government had led to the 4 lead scientists named on the patent only having a 5% personal interest in any fees coming out of the patent, with 80% going to the French government specifically in support of nuclear physics research. He had understood that my father had negotiated during the war, notably with the English, such as he would then have got 12% rather than 5%. Is this true? Was my father greedy? I don't know. It would rather surprise me. I knew him as a very ambitious and occasionally intolerant person, a wonderful father, but he had his moments. He was, however, recognized both in the family and also, I now see from all the papers that I have, by his colleagues as well, as an extremely generous and caring man who was deeply committed to research. And as Bertrand Goldschmidt says in his obituary, and I think in the book too, my father supported with his own money the salaries of several of his colleagues, but never let it be known that he was providing the money. So it would slightly surprise me if my father's efforts with regard to the patents and the British government were simply to get more money. It doesn't really make much sense. Did he sell the French short? According to everything that I've seen, that was not the case. On the contrary, it was the English and the Americans who were kind of hands-off on anything to do with the French because they didn't want to recognize the French contribution. So it's all a little bit grey zoney, but I think that Joliot had misinterpreted what my father had been doing, but I can quite understand why he misinterpreted in that way. That's being as objective as I can based on the anecdotal information that's available to me. On my father's side, he was initially offered a job in Paris by Joliot, and he turned that down. And I think he turned that down because he already felt that Joliot was no longer trusting in him.
This was in 19...
This is in 1945, yeah. That was one reason. The second reason was that he felt he wasn't going to be given enough independence and recognition for his work during the war, and that he would be going back to square one as a postdoc in essence, and he didn't want to do that. and he was a proud and ambitious man. So there was a bit of that. And also, the American government, thanks to General Groves, refused to allow my father to return to Paris throughout 1945 because he considered him a security risk. So he was trapped in the North American continent, initially in Montreal, and then with my mother they moved to New York. So he couldn't go back to assume any position in France.
Until after the war?
Until some time after the war. So it was late 1945, early 46 before he returned. And by that time, Lindemann in Cambridge had offered him what was a very attractive, in Oxford, sorry, had offered him what was a very attractive job. So he gave up on France, I think with some bitterness, and moved to England and was very happy in Oxford for 8 years or so, until he was called back by the French government to start up a lab and to develop the first reactor near Paris.
Wow, well, that's wonderful. A nice précis of what he did from 36 to 46. So let's go back, if you're willing, to talk about some of the drama of early in the war, when he has joined Joliot in 37 at the Collège de France, and what they were working on and who he was working.
As far as I understand it, their work was, first of all, entirely theoretical. And in fact, all of the groups, Fermi included, Frisch included, Bohr included, in the late 30s, it was still entirely theoretical. So the focus was on the atom, the properties of the atom, the properties of nuclear elements, and as far as one can see from the literature, at more or less the same time, after the initial observation of nuclear fission by Frisch, both the Fermi lab in Chicago and the Joliot-Curie group in Paris independently calculated the amount of energy that would be released by the fission event and determined that the energy was sufficient to lead to a chain reaction that would in turn release an extraordinary amount of energy. And Bertrand Goldschmidt, in his book and obituary of my father, actually mentions the figure, the number that they calculated, which he says was extremely close to reality. So the French group really understood what was going on, and on the basis of their observation of a chain reaction, understood that the energy had to be contained, focused on the use of heavy water for containment, and issued through the French Patent Office a series of 5 patents, as I understand it, 3 or 5, which focus for the most part on the production of energy from a chain reaction, but which I think also made allusion to the possibility of a weapon. But the main thrust of their work was nuclear energy, and that remained the focus of my father's work throughout the rest of his career. So his relationship to the bomb is actually quite far removed, especially given the fact that he wasn't allowed to work on the bomb whatsoever during the war based in Montreal. That, in fact, was, in retrospect, probably a relief for him. It was never, from my conversations with him, of any direct interest to him in his theoretical work, and morally and emotionally, I think he took a fairly firm position in regarding the atom bomb and the H-bomb as a dangerous and obviously politically, highly charged development. And Joliot-Curie, who was an admitted communist during the war and joined the party, was always very, very vocally against development of an atomic weapon. And those were two reasons for his being completely removed from the French atomic effort as from 1950 or 51. So there was a lot of political motivation and mischief going on throughout this period, which made the science actually very difficult.
So I assume that it was part of Grove's kind of aversion, shall we say, to having further conversation between your father when he was in Montreal and Joliot in France, that he worried that Joliot was, as a communist, that he was collaborating potentially with the Russians, or as nobody knew where Joliot stood.
Exactly.
He may be collaborating with Vichy France.
So that's right. I think there were two levels of mistrust from Grove's side. So as a general, he obviously had the country's security at heart, and he was also central to the Manhattan Project. He felt that he felt throughout the war that my father was not to be trusted because, first of all, he was French, and the French had capitulated, which obviously to an army man wasn't a particularly worthy way to go. Not only was he French, but he was also Austrian. And clearly to someone like Groves, with his education and mindset, Austrian meant German, because everybody speaks German. Austria had been taken over without much resistance, to put it mildly, by Hitler. And therefore anybody who was anybody who was Austrian was basically German, and anybody who was German was a Nazi. So that was no good. So you can't have somebody like Halban in charge of a group working, albeit not directly related to the Manhattan Project, but nonetheless right next door in Montreal, and with access to uranium and with access to heavy water and in communication with Fermi. All of that I can understand. If you put yourself in Grove's shoes, was pretty nasty. I mean, people like Groves want things to be simple and straightforward, and this was not simple or straightforward. This was messy, and he didn't like messiness. So he kind of put my father to the side and had him replaced as director of the lab towards the end of the war, and prevented him, as I just said, going back to Europe basically throughout 1945. There, probably because of his suspicions of Joliot as being a communist and a foreigner. I mean, he was French, he wasn't American or English, and therefore not to be trusted. So I think you're right on both counts. Both because my father was Austrian and therefore not to be trusted, and because Joliot was French and a communist to boot, and therefore couldn't be trusted. Now, ironically, whilst Groves was obsessing about my father in direct contradiction to everything that the senior scientists in the Anglo-French effort were saying, including Cockcroft, including Chadwick, who were all fully supportive of my father, it was only Groves who went against him. Whilst he was obsessing about this, there was a spy in their midst. So there was a spy in Montreal called Alan Nunn May, who went over to the Soviets at the end of the war with all the information, including from his visits to the Fermi lab in Chicago. So he took everything with him, from Montreal and from Chicago. And under Grove's watch, under Grove's careful watch, Klaus Fuchs was embedded in Los Alamos and went over to the Soviets as well. So he would have been better spending his time and energy and anger and directed against the spies in his own midst rather than these two individuals who were clearly not doing anything untoward towards the US government or indeed the Allies. It's funny how these things work out. That's Grove's, and that's what made the Anglo-French effort difficult scientifically, because they weren't allowed to gain access to the materials or information that would have allowed them to advance more rapidly. And the other political side to the whole story regards the patents that the French took out and which were never recognized by the United States. And throughout the 1950s, according to the papers that I have in my files, my father made every attempt through the US courts and the US Patent Office to get the French patents recognized, and they never were. So the final decision was, I think, in 1958. There was an appeal, the appeal was rejected, so there was never formal recognition of the patents, and therefore the French government never derived any financial interest from the discoveries that the French team had made, despite the fact that the discoveries were truly seminal, groundbreaking. That's the way history goes. Governments have to defend their turf. And interestingly enough, the US government in 1968, through the Atomic Energy Committee, is it committee? AEC? Commission. Through the Atomic Energy Commission, ended up recognizing the contribution of the French group and awarded a prize posthumously to 3 out of the 4. Kovarski was, I think, still alive at the time, in recognition of their contributions. So the patents weren't accepted, but at the scientific level, the contribution was accepted as being major. So, you know, from the academic and scientific point of view, that was a nice thing to see, albeit my father was unhappily already dead.
Tell me, why don't you just explain what that contribution was, briefly?
I'm not sure that I can, other than that it was, as I understand it, ostensibly the one of the first, so the first or the second, clear demonstration of a chain reaction and of the energy that such a reaction could emit, and in turn how that energy could be contained and be put to good use in a nuclear reactor. That was the central core of the discovery and the patents. And amusingly enough, not amusingly, obviously, the French government stood by their group and stood by their patents and felt that the French, had demonstrated for the first time the possibility of a chain reaction and of the energy that could be derived from such a reaction. And they even produced a medal, which I have and I've shown to you, and we can photograph it, commemorating that event. And on the one side, one face of the medal, you see a list of all the Nobel Prizes from the beginning of the 20th century through until Joliot-Curie's prize that contributed towards our understanding of nuclear physics. And you see a series of profiles of the scientists involved, and the only profiles that you can clearly distinguish of the four French scientists, so Joliot, Perrin, Kovarski, and my father. And on the flip side, you see a rather nice design, and on top of the design, it's mentioned chain reaction with a date, 1939, and the name of the four French scientists. So the French had no doubt whatsoever that they were commemorating a major French discovery.
And what was the date of the medal?
I don't know, it's not on. I think presumably sometime, to the extent that my father had it, I remember it being in his house, it must have been during the 50s that they minted this medal. And there's also, as a scientist, what I find to be a fascinating anecdote, new twist to the story that came out just a few years ago. When my father moved from France to England in 1940 with the world stock of heavy water, he was set up with a lab with Kovarski in Cambridge. And they continued to work very actively, continued their research in Cambridge, and obviously came up with some quite important and remarkable findings that they put into a manuscript that they wished to publish. And they showed the manuscript to, as they were obliged to do, after all we were in the war, and what's more, they were foreigners. They showed the manuscript to Chadwick, the Nobel Prize laureate, who was in charge of the entire research effort in that domain. And he said, look, this is fantastic science, but we're in a war, and this can't be published because it's too sensitive. So here's what I'm going to do. The war's going to end one day. I'm going to take the manuscript, I'm going to put it in an envelope, I'm going to seal the envelope, I'm going to sign over the seal, and I'm going to deposit it with the Royal Society in London. And after the war, the envelope will be opened, your manuscript will be found, and it will then be published and dated back to 1940, regardless of the year in which the envelope is open. That way you get scientific priority. Despite the fact that Chadwick notoriously was totally uninterested in scientific priority and only in the science. But he recognized that, you know, scientists do care about this sort of thing. So that was nice, and nobody remembered that. Nobody knew anything about it. And for some reason, neither my father nor Kovarski remembered either. So at the end of the war, nobody went to the Royal Society and said, hey, could we have this envelope and we'd like our manuscript back. Nobody did anything. So I think it was just 5 or 10 years ago, I came across a little piece in Science, the magazine, and on the BBC, saying that on the 75th anniversary or something or other, the Royal Society was cleaning up their archives and came across this envelope sealed and signed by Chadwick, and they opened it up and they found a little letter from Chadwick explaining whoever opens it, a bit like a message in a bottle, right? Whoever opens this letter, this manuscript should be published, dated back to 1940. Obviously that was no longer possible, but extraordinary. And the manuscript was shown to scientists at CERN, here in Geneva, who said that it was extremely important, visionary, seminal discovery. So there we are. Science was clearly very good.
Amazing. I noticed that visiting CERN yesterday, and that Francis Perrin's photograph is among these many, like 15 scientists, including Niels Bohr and Oppenheimer and others. Can you tell us a little bit about him, since he was so integral to that paper and the other work with Joliot?
Francis Perrin, P-E-R-R-I-N. he was obviously an important member of the team, working under Joliot-Curie in the 30s, alongside my father and Kovarski. They are all cited on the patents. Their names figure, including Perrin, on the medal I just spoke about, and indeed on the patents. And Perrin would have been one of the 4 scientists deriving modest financial benefit from the patents had they been recognized. During the latter part of the war, Perrin worked with the Free French in London under de Gaulle, and immediately after the war was the first chair of the French Atomic Energy Authority, and is considered to this day the father of the French bomb. So the father of the French nuclear deterrent, as it's euphemistically called. So he was in charge of the whole body of research leading up to the development of the French bomb in his capacity as chair of the Atomic Energy Authority, and was also, as I understand it, supportive of my father's call back to France by the Prime Minister at the time, Mendes France, and this was in 1955, which my father accepted and moved from Oxford back to Paris and was in charge of the laboratory in Saclay, just outside Paris, where the first French nuclear reactor was developed. So it's a nice end to the story as far as my father's concerned, and Perrin was really central to this entire effort and was a brilliant scientist and not only highly regarded but I think well liked by everybody. So it's entirely fitting that his photo should be in CERN.
The laboratory that your dad worked in Saclay was part of that research for the bomb?
No.
No.
He was an academic and his work was entirely theoretical, and as I understand it, he was not directly involved in the development, in the work leading up to the first test of a French nuclear device. That's my understanding. I may be wrong.
Great, this is very helpful. I'd love to get whatever story, it may be anecdotal and first, second hand, but that's what we had, about the whole escape. If you could start from France in 1950.
Yeah, that I do know a little bit about from chatting with my father as a child, and from his diaries that I have. I have a copy of his diary from the time, from the 1940s, from 1940 through until the end of the war. And the one from 1940 is actually quite detailed. And I also have a copy of his marching orders from the French government, allowing him, or telling him, and Kovarski to leave France. And it all happened very, very rapidly in June of 1940. Literally within a day of the Germans arriving in Paris, they were already on the boat from Bordeaux to England with the stockpile of heavy water that the French government had got from Norway and had been keeping in Paris, and it was now obviously not the place to have the heavy water stocked, and it was clearly not the place to have the scientists doing their work. In the stories that are written about this, in the books that I've read at any rate, we're told that Joliot-Curie was in Bordeaux and at the last minute decided that he wasn't going to go, in a kind of heroic last stand. It looks as if it was a little bit more careful and thoughtful than that, because the marching orders only mention my father's name and Kovarski and their wives and their children, but not Joliot-Curie or his family. So he clearly been in contact with the French government and said, look, I'm not going to leave because I think my place is here, even if the Germans are here, and I think this is the best way for me to defend the French cause. But I do want Halban and Kovarski to leave with the heavy water. So he was entirely agreeable and supportive of their leaving. He wanted them to leave, but he didn't want to leave himself. I was saying they boarded this coal ship. It looked like a pretty rickety affair. My sister, who was 1 or 2 at the time, sat on the canisters of heavy water, or so she believed. She was obviously much too young to remember, but she always told everybody this story with great pride. And they were guided in this enterprise by a flamboyant English Earl, the Earl of Suffolk, and they reached England. And according to my father's diaries, their reception was very warm from most of his scientist colleagues, but less than lukewarm from several members of the government, and notably civil servants, who, just like Groves, considered this Kovarski, who was a huge, rather imposing, clearly non-Englishman, and my father with a suspicious name and origin, to really be under suspicion. And they were clearly led to understand that they were secondary to any serious research effort that the English were undertaking, and that their contributions to nuclear physics were secondary, certainly secondary to anything the English had done. So it was kind of pretty nasty atmosphere at the official level, but extremely collegial and welcoming at the scientific level.
So who were some of the more welcoming scientists?
Well, I think foremost among them would be Chadwick and Cockcroft at the same time. Rudy Piles was in Cambridge at the time. Later in Oxford, I remember seeing him on several occasions. My father and he hit it off, and my father certainly had great respect for Piles, and probably that was reciprocated once they'd understood what the French had been up to. It should be remembered that the French work had been published in Nature, so this had been, they had 3 more or less back-to-back papers in Nature, which the English had obviously read. They'd been to scientific meetings, they knew each other. So the hostility of the civil servants was actually totally misplaced. But it was so extreme, their mistrust, that I remember my father telling this extraordinary story. He had to drive from Cambridge from London to Cambridge a few weeks after arriving in England to start his work there. He didn't know where he was. He didn't have a map of England, and no maps were available or made available to him because he was suspect. I guess the civil servants thought he was going to send a cable to the Germans telling them how to get from London to Cambridge. I mean, it just seems totally absurd. Anyway, he had no map, and he was given to memorize a list of pubs. Okay? And the way he was supposed to get from London to Cambridge was to go from village to village asking for the name of the next pub, because it was supposed that the people living in these various villages would know the name of the pub in the neighbouring village. So you could hop from stone to stone and from village to village, from pub to pub, until he reached Cambridge. So their mistrust was extreme and absurd. And that went on basically throughout the war. In addition to there being no maps, street signs had apparently been taken down, according to Bertrand Goldschmidt in his book, again making it almost impossible for somebody who wasn't familiar with a town or a city, let alone how to get from one to the other, to make his way around the country. So they were under deep suspicion, but despite that, I think my father had a successful and exciting scientific time, however brief, in Cambridge before moving to Montreal, and certainly gained the sufficient trust from his scientific colleagues to have been given the leadership of the Anglo-French effort in Montreal.
So tell us about that. Tell us what was going on in Montreal. What was the objective?
As I understand it, the objective was not to develop a weapon, even if this was part of the so-called tube alloys project. The focus of the Anglo-French effort in Montreal was to continue the French work on the chain reaction and to use heavy water as the containment element for development of a nuclear reactor. That's what they were supposed to work on. Whether or not they managed to do serious work in this particular field in Montreal, I don't know. All I do know is that from what I've seen, from the correspondence and from the diaries, the Anglo-French group in Montreal weren't given access to the materials or to the information that they would have needed to advance their research in a timely fashion. So I think they were kind of bogged down by bureaucracy and by the problems surrounding any research effort in the war. I don't think anybody's to be blamed for that. I think it's just those were the circumstances.
Your dad was initially the director, and then what happened to change that?
I think the official storyline is that Groves wanted him replaced as director of the lab because he had no confidence in him. I think there was a hidden storyline that he wasn't considered by all his colleagues or by the Canadian government as a particularly able director or administrator. I don't think his science was questioned, but I think the way he was leading the lab and his administrative skills were put into question, from what I've seen from the correspondence and the documents. Which was the guiding lead factor, I don't know. But there clearly were troubles. I don't think that it was a group of happy campers,
So
frankly.
he did have one trip to London, that then a side trip to Paris to see Joliot.
Yes, yep.
At a time that Groves was trying to contain his movements.
Yep.
I don't know the chronology, maybe you could help. Was he removed from director after that meeting, or was that?
I don't. Honestly, I don't know. It is true that he went to London. I guess in summer or autumn of '44, I think it was, and went to Paris, and met with Joliot, and I have letters between him and Joliot at that time, and the relationship was at that point entirely collegial, and that's the irony. My father went in full respect respect of his commitment to the French, in order to debrief Joliot on everything that they'd been doing in Montreal and to keep him fully up to speed. Groves saw this as my father divulging state secrets, despite the fact that Joliot was part of the effort, even if he'd stayed in France. And was it on this occasion that Joliot first started to think that my father hadn't represented their cause as well as he, Joliot, thought he should have done? I don't know. Or did that come a few months later? But certainly that visit happened, and for Halban, for my father and Joliot, that was considered an extremely important moment to update Joliot on everything that had been going on. So I've never really understood how the relationship broke down to the extent that it did between my father and Joliot. Hard to tell.
So let's back up a second and talk about another character in this story, Lew Kowarski. What can you tell us about him?
So Kovarski was, I think, of Polish origin. So again, to go back to Groves and to the British civil servants, you know, my father was Austrian, but Polish going further back. Here was Kovarski. All this Mitteleuropa, as we call it, all these figures from deepest Central Europe were clearly suspicious. So Kovarski was clearly working side by side with my father in Joliot's lab, and thereafter, well, they took the boat together from France to England, worked together in Cambridge, wrote this manuscript together that was discovered so much later in the Royal Society archives, went with my father to Montreal. So clearly they were very close colleagues. From what I recall as a child at home, I don't think my father held Kovarski in the highest esteem and often made slightly disparaging comments about him. But despite that, they clearly worked together as colleagues. And Kovarski went on to have a highly distinguished career, post-war career in Geneva, and was one of the founding fathers of CERN. So he was clearly a distinguished scientist, maybe had slightly less sophisticated social skills than my father and many of the other colleagues, including Bertrand Goldschmidt, who were more worldly. That has nothing to do with their science, simply their social skills and the way they interacted in society with civil servants and with their colleagues that maybe made Kovarski a little more difficult to fathom. I would put it down to that rather than anything more significant.
That's interesting. I think that Goldsmith talks about how in his time, over time, having associated with Joliot and your father, and then after that, he, whatever rough edges he had, what disadvantages he had from not having had such a sort of well-to-do upbringing that made him at ease socially, he became more and more socially adept.
And I'm sure that's right.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's right. I never met him. I did meet his widow when I moved to Geneva in the 70s. She was still living here, and she invited me to tea, and we had a very nice time together. And I didn't detect anything untoward, certainly in her reaction towards me. She was kind, generous, and open. So I think it was just as you say. I think he was one of these scientists, and as a scientist myself, albeit a biologist, not a physicist, but I recognize this amongst my colleagues. There are those who are very able in promoting their science and their cause, and there are others who are withdrawn and maybe more complex in their interaction with the outside world, but that doesn't make their science any the less interesting or important. And I would put Kovarski, I hope objectively, in that latter category.
And he obviously was recognized over time.
Absolutely,
Yes.
yeah, yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you for that. Let's see here. Do you know this code that Joliot used to describe your father and Kovarski's going to England with heavy water? Do you remember what he said?
It's funny, at the time, just after my father and Kovarski had left France and arrived in London, Joliot-Curie sent a cable, and obviously he was concerned that people would understand, notably the Germans, what had been going on. So he said H and K have arrived with the glue. So H and K is Halban and Kovarski, and the glue is presumably heavy water. And I have no idea where that particular kind of jokey slang came from. Was it the word that they used within the lab in a kind of jokey way between themselves when they were referring to heavy water, or was it something that Joliot thought up on the spur of the moment? Who knows? But kind of funny anecdote. Yeah, so as I understand it from my father's diaries, which, as I said, are very personal, very detailed, and also scientifically quite interesting. So he comments both on kind of day-to-day activities as well as meetings with senior government officials, including Anderson, Chancellor of the Exchequer, who was responsible for the whole project, also his other colleagues, and he very often mentions those who were welcoming, open, and kind, and in particular Chadwick, but also the other senior members of the Cambridge team, and how much pleasure he got both as a human being, but also as a scientist, being able to share his views, share his experience, share his results, share his thinking with what were, of course, the leaders in the field that he'd met at scientific meetings, but had never had the occasion to discuss with in such an intimate way. And Chadwick in particular was clearly friendly, warm and supportive from the first day and throughout the war. So when he first moved to Cambridge, Chadwick was always there, always supportive, always listening to him, always putting the French results, kind of putting them on a pedestal rather than the exact opposite, which is what some other Englishmen were doing at the time. Clearly supported their work, clearly thought that what they were doing in Cambridge was important. My father was very deeply concerned about Joliot's fate and his family in Paris under the German occupation, and asked of his colleagues and of the government officials very frequently, I mean basically at every meeting, have you heard from Joliot? Is everything okay? Is there anything that we can be doing to make sure that that he's all right? After all, he was a scientist under occupation, working in a field of considerable interest to the Germans, as we now know. he could have been treated very badly. As it happened, he wasn't, as we understand it. But my father was very concerned about that.
That's great. Now, one other thing that from his diary that I think is worth mentioning, he talks about, we saw the whole of English society as outsiders, probably better than the English themselves. And this was in the context of looking at the British attitude after the fall of France. And he summed it up: we will not go down without a fight. And he said he got this impression from the porters, from the bellmen, from whole swath of the society. So if you can remember that from the diary, maybe tell us a little about it.
Well, I think anybody living in those times in England would have quite naturally deeply resented the French capitulation and the fact that they surrendered and were overwhelmed by the Germans so rapidly, leading to the retreat of the British forces from Dunkirk, and kind of legendary British resilience. And one can understand that the British would see the French as being kind of lily-livered and cowardly. And here were these two foreigners, and even if they had a French passport, they weren't really French, but they came from France. And my father certainly had a French passport. Kovarski, I'm not so sure. So you can imagine, I mean, even talking today with a London cabbie, a London cab driver, they're pretty outspoken. And I'm sure at every level of society, from that all the way up to the upper classes, which my father moved in. So he moved in all circles. He had friends from France, outside of France, who he surely saw in London, so the English side of his contacts, who were kind of upper class. But at the same time, he met with porters and taxi drivers or whatever. So he probably heard the same story from everybody, you know. What is it with you French that you just give in? And my father picked up on that. And I think he probably understood it, but certainly resented it when civil servants and some of the scientists put this all into a great big package. The French surrendered, the French are cowards. French science must therefore be in some ways second-rate and cowardly, and should be discounted. I mean, it was all put into a great big amalgam, which was unfortunate and probably made my father feel a little uncomfortable. I think, despite the fact that he was exposed to suspicion by many English because of his origins and because of the fact that he came from France, at the same time, he had been horrified, literally horrified, not just disappointed, but horrified by the capitulation of the Austrians towards the Germans, and was clearly deeply upset that the French had been forced to surrender so quickly and that the Germans had taken over the country and arrived in Paris very rapidly in 1940. So that was clearly traumatic to everybody, but certainly to him as an Austrian emigre who went to France, and then the whole thing repeats itself in a sense. And then going to England and seeing this admirable resilience, which clearly caught his attention, that he admired, and that to a certain extent fascinated him. So at the same time he was being put under suspicion by the English, but at the same time he was admiring the resilience and this is where it's going to happen, we're not going to surrender, we're going to win this war. You couldn't not but be impressed and overwhelmed by that sort of attitude. Again, at all levels of society. My mother was born Aline, A-L-I-N-E, de Gunsberg, was her maiden name. She was French. She was actually born in London, anecdotally, but she was French. Her mother was French from Alsace, and her father was Russian. So she came from a Russian-French Jewish family on both sides. She was raised in France, was a great golfer. She was French champion of golf. She married very young, when she was just 18 or 19. Had a son, my half-brother, Michel, and her first husband died of cancer a couple of years later. This was by then 1939 or so. My mother was born in 1915, so she was very young, had a child, young boy, was a widow, was a Jew, and the war started. So she moved from Paris with her family to the south of France under the Vichy government, and she actually said that she really enjoyed that period of her life. She was very competitive and had considerable initiative and was frightened of nothing. She had to drive to Vichy to get her exit permit, drove back to Biarritz where she was based, got all the paperwork done through a friend who was Argentinian ambassador to France, got out through Spain and Lisbon, took a boat from Lisbon to New York, and it was in New York that she met, through common friends, my father. They married during the war. She moved to Montreal with him, and my brother was conceived in Montreal and born in New York in 1946. And she moved back to Oxford with my father in 1945-46. I was born in Oxford in 1950, and my parents divorced in 1956, and my father moved back to Paris in 1955, just before the divorce, to take up his new job at Saclay. And my mother, who was, as I said, an extraordinary woman from many points of view, and a wonderful mother, went on to marry again, so widowed, divorced, and then married again the British philosopher Isaiah Berlin. And they lived together in Oxford until their deaths. So that's my mother.
So did you stay with your mother or your father?
No, I lived in Oxford with my mother and stepfather, and visited half of every holidays with my father, first in Paris, and after he had to leave for health reasons, he stopped working in Paris in the early 60s, and his last years, until 1964 when he died, were spent in Switzerland, where he had a house. So I went there every holiday.
So as a biologist, he had heart issues. Bertrand Goldsmith said he was an excellent skier. So obviously, as a youth or a young man, he was very athletic.
He was a wonderful skier. He even had his ski teacher's license, and he won racing cups, one of which I still have. And he had a heart condition which was probably congenital, with a problem with one of his valves, I suspect the aortic valve. And even in the 1930s, he had some sort of symptoms of that valve problem and lived with those symptoms throughout the rest of his life until he was operated on in Paris at the American hospital in 1964, at a time when heart valve replacement surgery was in its infancy. And although the operation itself, I think, was successful in replacing the valve, he got a horrid systemic infection and died a couple of weeks after the operation. I remember, as a child, one often wants to emulate one's father. Had he been a fireman, I probably would have wanted to be a fireman, but he was a scientist. So I decided at an early age I wanted to be a scientist. I remember very clearly talking with him what it was like to be a scientist, what research involved. I remember him telling me that if I wanted to be a scientist, I would have to be very good at maths and would have to learn German. So this was in the 1950s, at a time, certainly in the hard sciences. He assumed, I suppose, that I was wanting to be a physicist, that maths would be important. I was terrible at maths, always was, which is why we did biology, because it required less maths. And at the time, German was the major scientific language, and I failed to learn German either. But luckily, English took over as the major scientific language, so I was okay. But he was passionate about science. And on a more personal level, clearly regarded as a very charming man. He adored music, classical music. As children, took us to the Salzburg Festival at a very young age to go to wonderful operas. Always had music on, mainly chamber music, at home from the early hours. Always took his bath listening to Schubert, chamber music. Loved art as well. Was passionate about art, but really passionate about science. And really inspired me as to what science had done for him as a person and what science could do for society.
You want to elaborate on that? What science could do for society? How is that manifested from his work?
Well, we never spoke about the bomb, or indeed any details of his work. I mean, I knew he was a nuclear physicist, and I knew about the chain reaction, and I knew that obviously there had been the development of a bomb, but I never regarded my father as, from the discussions and from my memories I have of him, as having been central to that particular effort, the development or working on the bomb. We never spoke about it. But he did communicate very clearly how exciting it was to discover how the world works and how fundamentally important it was for human beings to pursue that understanding of the world, to ask the right questions, and how exciting it was to get the answers from one's own research. I mean, that I remember very clearly. And he was right. It is exciting. And I think I've derived the same sort of excitement and fulfillment from research as he did. And I think from reading what other scientists have said about him, even if some have commented on his administrational skills or lack thereof, and sometimes he could be a little impatient and overpowering, but all of them seem to say that he was a visionary and communicated his enthusiasm for science to his entourage and to his colleagues, particularly to the juniors. To the juniors in his group. At least that's something that I would really like to believe, because that's the side of him that I saw as his child.
So what would you say to young people today about going into science?
What I would say, and what I do say, is that it's the most fantastic profession one could possibly imagine, because it gives one complete intellectual freedom to pursue one's interests, to try to answer fundamental questions. It's actually a great luxury to be able to do throughout one's professional life exactly what one wants to do, and to gain such enormous satisfaction. So I would say that it's really exciting, it's really fulfilling, it's fantastic. I can think of no better profession. There is a but, and it's going to sound a little bit arrogant, but it's the truth. And I'm not speaking for myself, I can only speak for others and my guidance to others. There's no point in doing it unless you're very good. Particularly nowadays, when in cell biology, cell and molecular biology, which is in a sense today what nuclear physics was in the 30s, 40s and early 50s, it's kind of one of the lead fields in science. It's so competitive that if you want to succeed, and only in succeeding will you be able to derive any personal satisfaction, you have to be good. So you have to have your eyes open, and you have to be very honest in your self-assessment. And if you're not going to be at the top, then go for something else. Use these same skills, but in another environment, not as a group leader or a scientific director in your chosen field, because that's doomed to failure and you'll be miserable.
Well, that's very honest advice.
So that's what I tell the young. Some of them follow it, some of them don't. Some of them succeed, some of them don't. Some of them are happy, some of them are not. That's the way it goes.
That's great. So looking back on your dad again, would you say he was one of the happier ones about his chosen field or about his life?
Yes, yes, but with this huge proviso of everything that happened during the war. So for somebody who, as I've said, was very competitive, who also, I think, sought recognition as part of his ambition, not, I think, because he wanted to be famous, and not, as I've already mentioned, because I think he wanted to derive personal financial benefit from his work, but I think just as a form of satisfaction and recognition. You know, I did this. Surely it's my right for everybody to acknowledge that I've done it. So I think that's perfectly understandable in a scientist. He didn't, as far as I can see, aside from trying to defend the patents for the French government, and that was clearly done in the interests of the French, not as an individual scientist. I see no evidence for his having trumpeted his own success. So I don't think he was trying to overdo it. I think he just wanted some sort of fully justifiable recognition. And the circumstances that we all understand now during the war, political and scientific, meant that in the end he probably wasn't as well recognized as he and many others, with hindsight, thought he should have been. Did that upset him or frustrate him? This is speculation. Probably yes. Did this make him embittered or unhappy? I don't think so. I think he was, albeit demanding of those around him, whether colleagues or in the family, a fundamentally happy man, and certainly towards the end of his career, committed to developing the lab and the reactor at Saclay, and very excited about that. So I think on the whole, he came out okay. He would have surely have come out better without the war, but that's true of so many people.
I was struck in reading his diary. He talked about someone whose name I've forgotten, but who had a breakdown. I mean, this was hugely tense and difficult times for so many people, including the scientists in this group at Cambridge.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the pressure was enormous. Because it was competitive, in any case, an innately competitive field, at the cutting edge of contemporary science at the time, and because of the huge implications for the war effort. So I have a very hard time imagining what it must have been like. I mean, I've worked in a competitive field, but without all the, as Ramsalt would say, fuss and stuff and nonsense that was going around at that time in terms of secrecy, pressure to get there first, pressure to get there before the Germans. Pretty soon, and before the end of the war, pressure not to give anything to the Soviets. Gosh, I mean, just imagine working under that sort of pressure, leaving aside the normal pressure of working in a competitive scientific field. Yeah, so I can imagine that some people couldn't take it. I can also imagine that it led to people reacting in pretty extreme ways, losing their patience, and maybe not doing things exactly as they would have done had there not been that sort of pressure. Yes. That's what makes the history of this particular field so fascinating. Admiration of you for taking on this whole project of preserving the atomic heritage, not only of your country, but obviously of the international effort, and now at this particular moment in your focus on this period of international research on the French effort. So, thank you for your interest. It's really important for the history of history of science, but also for obvious societal implications and interest as well.